So this lecture begins more or less where we left off last time with Servius Tullius. And Servius Tullius is the figure that in many ways redefines every aspect of the Roman monarchy, following his illegal seizure of power in the 6th century BC. Under Servius Tullius, what we saw was a refashioning of the way the monarch worked, so that, unlike past monarchs, Servius Tullius was not chosen by the aristocratic patrician order, but was instead chosen through a combination of the support of the hoplite soldiers and the regular people who voted on accepting his assertion of power as king. Once he took power, though, Servius Tullius redefined nearly every aspect of Roman life. The city under Servius Tullius's leadership grew in size and beauty, its citizenship expanded, and its political life became more inclusive. Servius also empowered the Roman infantry to participate in decisions, particularly decisions about war and peace that were brought before the Centuriate Assembly, the Comitia Centuriata, made up of those soldiers who owned enough property to serve in the phalanx. He also created an assembly based on the idea that your leadership and your participation in war gave you a larger role in deciding how the society would function and how the political life would work. Now, Servius ran Rome as a king whose power rested upon the support of a wide group of citizen soldiers. But Rome remained a small society, and this was not a big enough group that you could work entirely through only the soldiers. Servius had to work closely with two influential groups that still had reason to dislike his regime. And the first group consisted of relatives of Tarquinius Priscus, the preceding king, who felt that Servius Tullius had seized power that might rightfully have been claimed by a member of their family. Now, they too were not thinking that they would go through the traditional process of an interregnum, where they would sit before the patricians and the patricians would decide to nominate one of them, because as we saw last time, that process very rarely seems to have produced actually Roman-born monarchs. Instead, what you get are people like Tarquinius Priscus, people from abroad who don't have particularly long-rooted ties to the community, but are brought in to lead Rome because they are valuable and influential. The relatives of Tarquinius Priscus obviously didn't feel like they would get the vote of the aristocracy. They were not upset that Servius Tullius had taken power unconstitutionally. They were upset simply because if someone had to take power unconstitutionally, they felt it should be them, not him. Now, the second group, though, comprised members of the old Roman aristocracy that were sidelined by Servius Tullius's seizure of power and the political reforms that he put in place to make sure that his regime was stable. And Servius clearly did what he could to placate those figures. So not only did he supposedly marry one of Tarquinius Priscus's daughters himself, but he also arranged for his daughters to marry members of Tarquinius Priscus's family too. But even this was not enough. Ancient authors describe Servius Tullius's last days unfolding amid dramatic family intrigue. So he ultimately fell victim to a plot supposedly hatched by his own daughter Tullia and his son-in-law, Lucius Tarquinius, the husband of Tullia's brother. Now, she and Lucius Tarquinius then agreed to do away with their spouses, marry each other, and work to overthrow Servius Tullius. And the plot unfolded brutally, because Tarquinius, soon to be Tarquinius Superbus, understood that many of the Roman elite resented the reforms that Servius Tullius had undertaken. And so Tarquin went and appealed to each of these elites individually, with pitches tailored to their specific interests, promising, for example, to young people that he would give them riches and positions so that they could start their lives. He suggested to old people who remembered the way that kings were chosen before Servius Tullius that he would restore the kingship to the noble heights it had enjoyed under Tarquinius Priscus, rather than the low-born Servius Tullius, who was born a slave and came to power through really questionable means. Ultimately, when Tarquin felt that he had enough aristocratic support, he led armed men into the forum, he summoned the patricians, and he delivered a speech attacking Servius Tullius's low birth, his illegal seizure of power, and his promotion of the lowest sorts of people to power, a group to which the king himself belonged. Now, Servius arrived to try to rebut these charges, but when it became clear that the king retained significant popular support, Tarquin instead had him murdered. And sources differ about how this happened. Some sources say that assassins killed Servius Tullius in the street. Other sources say that Tarquin picked him up and threw him down the stairs of the Senate house, killing him. All agree, though, that whatever happened to him after Servius Tullius was dead, Tullia, his own daughter, ran over her father's body with her carriage on a street that came to be known as the Vicus Scleratus, the street of wickedness. And then, like Servius Tullius, Tarquin took power without an interregnum. And this, of course, would have surprised the aristocratic backers who felt that he was going to return constitutional order to the Roman monarchy. Tarquin, of course, had no interest in returning constitutional structure to the Roman monarchy. He just wanted to seize power for himself. And once he took power for himself, he ruled much like a Greek tyrant who tried to defend his power by undertaking great building projects and undertaking significant military campaigns. But some of these building projects were indeed really, really spectacular. So one of the things that Tarquinius built was the monumental temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. And here you see an image of that temple. You can see, of course, that this is structured, like we talked about a couple lectures ago, along an Etruscan style, with the pediment, the columns, and the sort of porch hanging out, and then the statues across the top of it. Now, this is what it would have looked like. This is a model of the Capitoline Temple of Jupiter. And you can see, again, this idea of the sort of closed internal sanctuary and then the pediment in front of it. And what's, of course, even more surprising is you can go and actually see the remains of this today. If you go to the Capitoline Museum, you can see the remains of the Temple of Jupiter today in the Capitoline Museum. Now, the building of a monumental temple like this may seem strange to us, and it might seem a sort of strange use of resources in a city like Rome, but building a massive temple, and the Temple of Jupiter was a massive temple, it had great propaganda power, because the tyrant then is not just a political leader. He's also a figure who is asserting a kind of religious authority that supersedes anything the aristocrats who came before him were able to do. But the one thing that is true about ancient tyrannies in Greece and in Rome is that they're never particularly stable. Tyrants like Tarquinius Superbus had real difficulty holding power for more than a couple of generations. And the reason was that as the tyranny takes hold, the disempowered aristocracy resented the power of the tyrants. But at the same time, the hoplites, who had backed the initial overthrow of the government, they became content with what they had received under the tyranny. And so they didn't need to support the tyrant as strongly as before. And so the aristocrats were looking for an opportunity to take power back, while the hoplites were less interested in defending the tyrant. And when this eventually plays out in Rome, it does so in a rather unique way. If you remember in the past, the situation had been one where the king was chosen by the patricians during an interregnum, and then people would vote to approve the choice. The last two kings had ignored the interregnum. Both Servius Tullius and Tarquin had ignored the interregnum, and they were instead chosen just simply by the people, by a vote of the people. They were not chosen by the patricians. And with Tarquin, it's even more slippery because he appealed to patricians to get support for the coup, but he didn't actually reward them with the role in government that they expected. And as the government of Tarquin progresses, what we see is he also cannot count on the support of the hoplites and the regular Romans. And so when Roman authors talk about the later phases of Tarquin's regime, they talk about it as a kind of closed state, in which Tarquin governed by consulting only members of his family. This is what Livy says. Cicero spoke of Tarquin beginning his reign with his hands stained with the blood of a most excellent king. That's, of course, Servius Tullius, who either Tarquin himself had killed or Tarquin had arranged to assassinate. And this made, Cicero continues, Tarquin fear that he might suffer the same highest penalty himself because of his crime. Dionysius of Halicarnassus is even more interesting because he says that Tarquin betrayed the patricians who had backed his coup by bringing charges against many of the most prominent men and accusing them of conspiring against the king and illegally condemning those men to death. What should have happened, at least according to the laws that Servius Tullius had put in place, is that no one should be condemned to death by the king. This is something where capital cases are supposed to go between the Comitia Centuriata, the centuries assembly, and they were voted on there. But Tarquin skipped that, and he just executed people under a kind of assertion of his own power. And so under Tarquin, an aristocratic counter-revolution begins to develop. And the historical tradition for this is, like a lot of early Roman history, of kind of patchy reliability. But the story goes like this. In 509 BC, Tarquin was leading an army in a campaign against the city of Ardea, and it's said that his son raped an aristocratic woman named Lucretia. Lucretia could not bear the shame of this deed, and so we're told she killed herself. And you can see in the center of this painting by Botticelli, you can see the sword, or the dagger in her heart, showing her having killed herself. Now, the death of Lucretia is particularly important because she is the wife of Tarquin's cousin, Collatinus. And her sacrifice, her suicide, inflames passions in the city, and soon a revolt develops led by Collatinus and Brutus. Now, Brutus is another nephew of Tarquin, and he'd been traveling with Collatinus, but he gets outraged when he sees the dead Lucretia. And we're told that he picked up the dagger that Lucretia had used to kill herself and swore to her corpse, "I will pursue Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, together with his wicked wife and all of his children, with whatever violence I can, and nor will I allow them or anyone else to be king at Rome." Now, what's interesting is that, of course, both Brutus and Collatinus are actually relatives of Tarquin. Brutus was his nephew and Collatinus was his cousin. But the revolutionaries, even though they're part of the family of Tarquin, are able to incite passions in the city against Tarquin. And when Tarquin hears about this, he leaves his army and tries to lead it back to Rome. And tries to return to Rome and leaves the army in Ardea in the control of his sons. But when Tarquin tries to return to the city from battle, his aristocratic opponents are able to prevent him from entering. They then go out, explain the situation to the army, and convince the army to turn against him as well. And Tarquin was then deposed. The story then goes on to say that Tarquin left Rome and allied with Lars Porsena, the king of the neighboring town of Clusium. And according to Roman traditions, Porsena attacks Rome and was defeated without capturing the city. But another tradition that's preserved in two later authors says that Porsena was actually successful and managed to take the city. But either way, whatever happened, whether Porsena took the city or not, Tarquin is not restored. Instead, Tarquin spends the rest of his life traveling to neighboring areas, trying to convince their governments to fight and restore him. And in 496, with the support of some Latin states, another campaign was launched, and it was defeated. And what's interesting about this campaign in 496 is that Lars Porsena, the king who had previously attacked Rome in order to have Tarquin restored, now fought with the Romans against the people looking to restore Tarquin. And Tarquin finally dies in 495 without ever having taken control of Rome. Now, the narrative that we have here is largely preserved for us in Livy, who's a 1st century BC source writing almost 500 years after the events. And it's an action-packed story full of lots of fun stuff, but scholars are pretty skeptical that a lot of it is reliable. And some assert that it's even a mythological story with none of the characters ever having existed at all. Now, I think that goes a little too far. I think that we can certainly say that there are real figures involved in this. But what we have to do is try to piece through the pieces of these stories, or the elements of these stories, that actually do make some sense in a historical context. So, for example, the traditional Roman story has some issues. If Lars Porsena, for example, did actually fight Rome and make peace with them because he was impressed with Roman valor, which is what Livy says, then what happens to Tarquin? Was Tarquin just sort of cast to the side? And why then does Porsenna turn around and fight the Latins who are supporting Tarquin? Porsenna's view and interaction with Tarquin is interesting and doesn't make a lot of sense. But the answer that we have about what actually happened is, quite frankly, we're not totally sure. Our best guess is that after Tarquin fell, the structures that he and Servius Tullius had put in place to assure Roman dominance in the region of Latium start to fall apart. And there's a kind of power vacuum, which leads to a lot of unrest and different people trying to take advantage of the power vacuum. Now, Porsenna may have been involved, once as someone fighting against Rome, and then again as someone defending it after his favored candidate had perhaps prevailed. But while Porsenna or someone like him may actually have played a role in these events, the most likely candidate for a true event is the battle in 496 between Rome and its Latin allies. This is the Battle of Lake Regulus. Now, the Battle of Lake Regulus is perhaps best understood in this broader context of Roman interactions with the peoples around them under the later Roman kings. Because in every change of government, there are people who benefit and people who suffer. Every revolution, of course, has its winners and its losers. And after the fall of Tarquin, probably the greatest losers were the people who had supported the kings. So these are the hoplite soldiers, but they are also the cities in Latium that had built relationships around the personalities and assurances of those kings. So with those kings down, and with Tarquin no longer in the picture, it's not exactly clear what Rome's relationship with the Latin states is going to be. And they also have, in some cases, a good and positive feeling about Tarquin. And so the Latin states are much happier with a status quo before the revolution than they are with a situation that follows the revolution. And this also perhaps has something to do with the fact that Servius Tullius and Tarquin also had worked to build ties with these Latin states that gave them the opportunity to have their citizens move to Rome and take on roles in the Roman state. So when the monarchy falls, these people would have been excluded from participation again, and the structures that they had taken for granted would have fallen apart. And so this is why, after the fall of the monarchy, Tarquin is able to go around to neighboring cities and get support for his restoration. This is, in a sense, reciprocity. He had done favors for people in those cities, and they now were looking to bring him back because they felt better about Rome under his direction than they did about Rome under the direction of the revolutionaries. Most cities, it seems, tried to figure out who was likely to win before they took a side. But the Latin League seems eventually, in the early years of the 400s BC, to have made a decision that they definitely wanted Tarquin back, and it was better for the Latin states to do this. Now, the Latin League is basically an assembly of Latin city-states that was dominated at that time by Rome. And they begin to fight against the new Roman order in 499, so 10 years after Tarquin is deposed. So they very clearly had given this a chance. They had tried to work with the new structure of Roman government, and they didn't like it. It didn't work for them. And so they begin to fight in 499, but ultimately they are defeated at the Battle of Lake Regulus in 496. And this is one of the pieces in this extremely confused narrative that does make sense. Because if you were in a Latin city at that time, and the Roman monarchy falls, a revolt might be something that you would consider doing because you're afraid of what the new regime is going to bring about. And so this is the process through which our sources say the Roman Republic came about. There's both internal aspects of Roman politics that lead to the overthrow of the kings, but then there's reverberations in Roman foreign policy that leads to all kinds of reactions against the Roman Revolution from city-states and from allies who had done reasonably well under Tarquin in particular. So if this is how the revolution is impacting outside of Rome, what did it exactly bring about in Rome itself? Well, this is the revolution, of course, that creates the Roman Republic. And the earliest Roman Republic is a counter-revolutionary state, a state that's designed to counteract the structures that Servius Tullius and to a degree Tarquin had put in place that had disempowered patricians and instead thrust power, given power to soldiers in the hoplite phalanx and these assemblies that included non-patricians as well. And so the earliest republic is a counter-revolution to this. It's a system of government that's designed almost entirely to favor patricians. It is, in a sense, completely flipping the structure that Servius Tullius had put in place, where patricians are, to a degree, marginalized in the political process. Now they are centralized, and the hoplites are marginalized. But the name republic indicates a very significant ideological shift in what the state should be. Because res publica means literally a thing that belongs to the public or a thing that belongs to the people. And the name is chosen to directly oppose the idea of a res privata or a private thing where the state completely belonged to an individual. Ideally in this context, or in this context, they mean Tarquinius Superbus. To keep things in line in the Republic, the two most important offices in the state, and actually all of the offices in the state, are held by a college of magistrates. That means that every individual who serves as a magistrate in the Roman Republic has a colleague, and that colleague is equally powerful. The idea there is that these people have a responsibility for cooperating with each other, and if they can't cooperate with each other, the Republic is perfectly comfortable with nothing happening. The idea is that this will prevent radical change, like that of Servius Tullius, or even like that of Tarquinius Superbus. But the Republic is designed, again, it is a counter-revolutionary state that is designed to prevent radical change. It's designed to move slowly and govern through consensus, and it's, of course, a consensus that is dominated by patricians. Now, the most important office in the Republic, according to tradition, and this is an office that was set up when the Republic was set up in 509 BC, this is the consulship. There are two consuls. They're elected for an annual term, so each served together for 1 year. They both stepped down, and two new consuls replaced them. And the consuls had the responsibility for leading Roman armies in war, for summoning meetings of the Comitia Centuriata, and for putting proposals before that. They also gave their names to the year. So, for example, the year 386 AD is called the consular year of Honorius and Euodius. Now, the two consuls, of course, serve together. They hold office together, they have equal powers, and they serve for 1 calendar year. And the idea there is that these people are really powerful individuals, but they check each other. It is a system really of checks. And that's why all of the magistracies have colleagues, because you want to check the ability of individuals to do things like Servius Tullius or Tarquin had done. You don't want to have a structure where people can achieve absolute power. The consuls also worked with former magistrates who were eligible to join an advisory body that comes to be called the Senate. Literally, the Senate means a group of old people. It comes from the Latin word senex, meaning old man. And the idea here is really this is an advisory board, and it seems for the first almost more than 200 years of the Republic, this is an advisory body that the consuls kind of put together themselves. But eventually, as we get into the 3rd century BC, the Senate becomes a standing body of former magistrates that advise the state. Now, we might think of the Senate as an entity that enjoys a kind of absolute power over what goes on in Rome, but constitutionally, it actually has very little formal power. It's designed to be a deliberative body, and it's a place where ideas can be debated, appropriate courses of action and responses to crises can be decided, and in practice, one always had to work through the Senate because of the prestige that the senators had and the tremendous political and social capital that they could deploy against you if you weren't working with them. But in theory, one could bypass the Senate. You could go completely to the side of the Senate and work through, say, assemblies and get popular votes to support laws. But in practice, this didn't happen very much. It wasn't good politics to do this, even if it was constitutionally possible. Now, in the early republic, it's important to understand that most of the offices in the state are designed to be held by members of the patrician order. And by the end of the 5th century, nearly all of the offices were dominated by people who were patricians. Now, to understand this structure is important, but it's also important to understand the stories that Romans told about how it is that this came about and how this structure for the republic was created. Now, the story that the Romans tell is that the two people responsible for the fall of Tarquin take the first turn as consuls, and these are Brutus and Collatinus. Now, this is a coin that shows Brutus. It comes from one of Brutus's descendants. It's issued by Marcus Junius Brutus, the future assassin of Julius Caesar. It's issued in 54 BC. And on the left, you can see the obverse of the coin, the head of the coin, if you will. It reads Libertas, and it shows a deity, liberty. And then on the reverse, what we see is a scene that shows Brutus as the first consul. On the bottom, you can read Brutus. And Brutus is walking, and behind him are people carrying, the ceremonial rods that mark one as a consul. These are his lictors. Now, the Roman tradition goes on to say that Brutus and Collatinus are the first consuls. And this is the most important office in the Republic, and so it makes sense that from the foundation of the Republic, this would be the structure that the leaders of the revolution would take and would use to assert their new authority for creating the structures of the Republic. Now, Brutus and Collatinus, as the first consuls, propose a set of laws. Two are really significant. The first is that there'll be no more kings, and anybody who tries to restore the monarchy will be killed. The second law holds that any Roman who's descended from a male member of the family of Tarquin must be expelled from the city. Now, the first law we'll get to its implications in a second, but the second law is particularly sneaky. Both Brutus and Collatinus are relatives of Tarquin, but Collatinus is a cousin of Tarquin through the male line. And so we're told that although Collatinus had been chosen as Brutus's consular colleague, Brutus contrived with the Senate to arrange for Collatinus to be forced out of office and sent into exile so that Rome could be rid of the royal name that Collatinus bore and ensure that the kingship will depart from Rome together with the Tarquinian family. And so Collatinus, the person who was married to Lucretia, the person who suffered the most in the assaults that led to the Roman Revolution, and one of Rome's first two consuls, is forced to leave the city as an exile soon after he took office simply because he shared the Tarquin family name. But Brutus, who was also from Tarquin's family, he was Tarquin's nephew, but was related to the king through his mother, he could remain in office because he didn't carry the name Tarquin and he wasn't tied to Tarquin through the male line. So Cicero was appalled by this. Cicero says the innocent Collatinus was expelled because of suspicion of his relationship to Tarquin. And it's notable, of course, here that he's called innocent. Even Cicero acknowledges he didn't do anything to deserve this fate. This is a power grab by Brutus. And so when one looks at the list of consuls, one notices that in 509 BC, Collatinus is not listed, only Brutus is, and this is the reason. But Brutus himself is forced to bear some of the pain for the laws that he put in place. Two of his sons were ultimately found trying to help Tarquin take control of the city. And when they were found, we're told that they were brought before Brutus and they were killed because the needs of the state trumps Brutus's own private needs and private desires. And so the story that we have here is something, again, that Dionysius of Halicarnassus speaks about. He says that the most extraordinary and astonishing part of Brutus's behavior was that while all the rest who were present at this sad spectacle wept, Brutus was the only person who was observed not to lament the fate of his sons nor to pity himself because of the desolation that was coming upon his house. And so the story we're supposed to absorb is that Brutus applied the laws to his own family members because it was the right thing to do. And in a nice coda, or not a nice coda, a coda to this, Brutus, we're told, is actually dies in office in battle defending the new republic. Now, before we leave the events that led to the development of the Republic, a lot of which are, as you can tell, woven with stories and narratives and kind of fictionalized accounts that emphasize the virtue of the founding fathers of the Roman Republic, it's important to turn our attention to a document that is none of these things, a document that actually seems to be a historical document from this period that allows us to understand some of the tensions that the Roman Republic was facing. And this is a treaty between Rome and Carthage. And the treaty has a number of provisions. The treaty is preserved in Polybius's history, and he says that he actually saw this treaty. So this treaty is a document that we, I think, can reasonably believe to be a legitimate document. And what you see here is the region that is under discussion in the map. The treaty reads, "There shall be friendship between the Romans and their allies, and the Carthaginians and their allies on these terms. Neither the Romans nor their allies are to sail beyond the fair promontory, unless compelled by storm or enemies. If any one of them is driven ashore, he shall not buy or take away anything, save what is needed for the repair of his ship or for ritual purposes, and he shall depart within 5 days." Now, the important aspect of this is that these are measures that regulate the interaction between Romans and Carthaginians on territory that is acknowledged to be Roman or Carthaginian territory. So the fair promontory is this part of North Africa that is, in a way, kind of protecting the city of Carthage. And if Romans or their allies sail beyond that, they can only do that in an emergency. And if that emergency happens, the only thing that they can do there is buy supplies to repair their ships, and then they need to get out. They need to leave. And they only have 5 days to repair their ships, and then they need to get out of that territory. And so it is, in a way, a kind of safe harbor, but only for a time. And Romans are not to conduct trading expeditions in that Carthaginian territory. Instead, it is only a safe harbor for them to repair their ships and leave. What's interesting is, as we go on, what we see is that men landing for trade shall conclude no business, save in the presence of a herald or a town clerk. Whatever is sold in the presence of these, let the price be secured to the seller on the credit of the state. And if any Roman comes to the Carthaginian province in Sicily, he shall enjoy all the rights of Romans. Now, this is an image of actually the harbor at Carthage. It gives you a sense of what Carthage itself looked like. This part of the document actually allows us to see that if Romans are in Sicily, it's a bit different. Romans shall enjoy the rights of Romans if they are in the Carthaginian province of Sicily. And so it's a little bit different than the relationship and the obligations and the restrictions that are placed on Romans if they land in North Africa. But the final part of the treaty is interesting because it talks about Carthaginian reciprocity. And so here we see Terracina and Circe. These are parts of what we will describe in a second. Because the final part just says that the Carthaginians shall do no injury to the people of Ardea, Antium, Laurentium, Circe, Sarcina, or to any other people of the Latins that are subject to Rome. And as to those which are not subject to Rome, the Carthaginians shall keep their hands off their cities, and if they take one of their cities, they shall deliver it unharmed to the Romans. They shall build no fort in Latium, and if they enter the country in arms, they shall not pass more than a night there. Now, this is a particularly interesting thing, because contrary to most of the documents and the materials that we've discussed so far, this actually is universally almost accepted as genuine. And so it represents a great source for the early Republic because the date of this treaty is somewhere between 509 and 507 BC. This is the moment of the creation of the Republic. And from the last section of it, what we see is the Carthaginians are effectively agreeing to a Roman sphere of influence. The Roman sphere of influence is one that includes Latium and also cities like Ardea. Now, Ardea is a particularly interesting thing to add in this context because, of course, the city that Tarquin is besieging when Lucretia is raped and when she kills herself is the city of Ardea. And so this is not a city that Rome controls at the time that this treaty is signed. Instead, what this represents is a kind of aspirational sphere of influence. But not only is Carthage acknowledging Rome's aspirational sphere of influence, the countries and the territories that Rome claims to control, even if it doesn't actually control them. The other thing that's important is that this represents a document that indicates that Carthage has accepted the legitimacy of the Republic as the government of Rome. And so this is a document that has a whole bunch of important implications. First of all, it shows that in that chaos where lots of people, the decade after the Republic is created, we see lots of people in Italy trying to challenge Roman hegemony, Roman domination over areas of Latium. Lars Porsena, if he existed, or whoever he represents in the historical tradition, is bouncing around from opposing the Republic to supporting the Republic. The Latin League is rebelling against Roman domination. There's all kinds of chaos about whether the Republic is the legitimate government in Rome. Tarquin and the people who fight to restore Tarquin clearly do not believe it's the legitimate government in Rome. There's also all kinds of tension about whether the Republic is going to be able to assert power over all of the territory that the later kings were able to assert power over. But here we have the Carthaginian Treaty. What the Carthaginians are saying is, we have made a treaty with the Republic. We acknowledge and recognize that it is a legitimate government. We acknowledge and recognize the sphere of influence that it claims. And we acknowledge and recognize that the Republic is the group of people and the structure that controls the Roman state. And so this is in many ways like when a modern regime overthrows a dictator, say, and the United States decides whether they want to recognize the government of that new territory or not. Carthage has at this moment recognized the government of the Roman Republic. And that's important because not everybody did this. And this will bring about a relationship between Rome and Carthage that is generally cooperative and remains cooperative for more than 200 years. And it's particularly interesting because, of course, when we think of Rome and Carthage, we think of them as rivals. But at this moment, this very early moment when the Republic is just taking shape and Romans are looking to define what their relationship with the people around them will be, Carthage is a strong and important ally.